Assalamu alaikum ji. I hope you are reviewing what we have been doing in the past, and I hope you are retaining most of it. We are into the 35th lecture today related to history and systems of psychology. We would touch upon one prominent psychologist, and we will wrap up what we had done related to Karen Horney's point of view. That is our lecture for today. Before we begin today's lecture, let us review what we had done in lecture number 34. If you recall, we talked about two prominent psychologists, psychotherapists on the North American continent. Can you recall who they were and what were their main contributions? First, who did we talk about in the last lecture? That's right, we talked about Harry Stack Sullivan. Harry Stack Sullivan, if you remember, had propounded the view, had put forward the view that the interpersonal relationship between an infant and his mother lead to euphoria, a feeling of extreme satisfaction and well-being in a child and an infant. And he wants that state of affairs to continue. He was of the view that the relationship between people, interpersonal relationships, determine by and large a psyche of a person. If you remember, we also talked about the mother providing him warmth and sympathy, at the same time passing on her insecurity to the infant if she herself is tense. आपको याद है कि हमारे मुल्क में, हमारे माशरे में बड़ी बूढ़ियां ख़वातीन कहती हैं अपनी बच्चियों से जो माँ बनती हैं कि अपने नए आने वाले बच्चों के साथ, इन्फेंट्स के साथ नहायत सुकून से और नहायत सब्र से पेश आओ. उनकी इस बात में एक बहुत अहम सच शामिल है, सच का अंसर शामिल है, और वही बात हमें सलीवन के नुक्ता नज़र में दिखाई दे रही है, that if the mother is tense, she passes on that tension on towards the infant, and that tension passed on from the mother remains with the baby for a long, long time. तो हमारी ख़वातीन जो हैं, इस खित्ते की ख़वातीन अपनी बच्चियों को जब ये कहती हैं that they should be relaxed when they are with their babies, they are very right. चलिए इससे आगे चलते हैं. Sullivan had said that the mother and the infant's relationship is a kind of later life interpersonal relationship pattern. And that pattern expresses itself in a number of experiences. He talks in particular about three kinds of experiences. Do you recall what those three kinds of experiences are that he talks about? Number one, he talks about, as you can see on your screen, proto-taxic experience. The other is what he called the taxic experience. As you can see on your screen again, the third experience that he talks about is what he calls the syntaxic experience. आपको याद है ये तीनों experiences क्या हैं? Sullivan also talks about 7 different stages of development depending upon interpersonal relationships. Or as a result of interpersonal relationships, the developmental stages can be seen from 7 different angles in Sullivan's point of view. And what is that? The first one is infancy. The second one is what he calls childhood period. Infancy is about up to 1 year of age, of chronological age. Childhood, in his point of view, is up to about 2 to 2.5 years, beginning from 1 year. The third stage is what he calls the juvenile era, about 3 years to about 6, 8 years, 7 years. Then what he says is the time of pre-adolescence, from about 8 to about 13 years. And then what he calls early adolescence, from about 13, 14 to about 18 years. And then adolescence, 6th stage. और फिर उसके बाद, in Sullivan's point of view, the 7th stage is what he calls maturity. Interpersonal experiences, in Sullivan's point of view, give rise to these experiences, 3 types of experiences, and 7 stages of development. And that is his basic theory of how a psychology functions, how a personality functions. We also talked about another prominent psychoanalyst of the North American continent, a contemporary of Sullivan's, and that was Karen Horney. If you remember, Karen Horney, I told you, trained in psychoanalysis, in classical psychoanalysis, and later on broke away because she thought that Freud had put in too much emphasis on sex as a drive in human psychology. And what did she say was the basic drive in human psychology? To her, if you remember, she talked about basic anxiety as the drive, as a main motivating force in the personality. We also talked about the basic anxiety giving rise to 3 different types of reactions. Do you recall what they were? 1, disguised hostility. 2, temper tantrums. And 3, withdrawal. We had talked about these 3 until the last time. Now let us dwell a little bit more on Karen Horney's theory. Karen Horney के ख्याल में एक शख्स की बेसिक एंजाइटी और उसके जो 3 रिएक्शंस हैं, they lead to what she calls neurotic trends. Neurotic trends or neurotic needs. In fact, she calls these neurotic needs. She prepared a list of neurotic needs which come from basic anxiety that a person feels. And what are those neurotic needs? You can see them on your screen. The first neurotic need is a need for approval. अगर कोई शख्स ये चाहे कि उसको हर दूसरा शख्स पसंद करे, उसकी तारीफ करे, तो हॉर्नी के ख्याल में ये एक न्यूरोटिक नीड है. ये एक तरह की ज़हनी बीमारी का इजहार है. ये हमारी वो ज़रूरत है जो गैर सेहतमंद ज़रूरत है. ये तो कुछ अजीब सी बात लग रही है कि अगर कोई शख्स requires he wants the approval of other people, then in Horney's point of view, this is a neurotic need. What do you think? Is it or is it not a neurotic need? The need for approval. You think it is not neurotic? No, it is neurotic. Because in Karen Horney's point of view, when you have the need for approval, your mental and physical health goes in the hands of other people. If they give you approval, you feel happy. If they don't give you approval, you feel unhappy. So you do not control your happiness or unhappiness, satisfaction or dissatisfaction. Because of this need that you have created in yourself, your happiness or satisfaction lies in the hands of other people. And that is why Karen Horney says that this is a neurotic need. Another need that she points out in this context is the need for domination. People want to dominate others. They want that others should be subservient to them, should obey them. And this, to her, is a neurotic need. Why is it neurotic? It's good, it's nice. No, it isn't nice, because if others are prepared to be dominated, become submissive, then you are satisfied. If they are not prepared to be dominated, if they are not submissive, then you are not satisfied. And that is why this is a neurotic need, because again, you have shifted the satisfaction of yourself to the attitude of others. If they are ready to submit, you are happy and satisfied. If they are not happy to submit, you are unhappy and dissatisfied. That is why she calls the need to dominate a neurotic need. Another need that she calls a neurotic need is what she calls confine one's life. It is, of course, in relevance to what she called the withdrawal reaction, that a person, in view of his basic anxiety, withdraws, confines himself to limited circles of social interaction or even to isolation. Excuse me. And why is that neurotic? Because you need other people. Everybody has a desire, what Adler had called social interest. So if you confine yourself, if you isolate yourself, then you are cut off from other people. And that is why it is neurotic in Horney's point of view. Another neurotic need, she says, is the need for independence. What's so neurotic about that? Because we are inherently dependent also. A person cannot fulfill his wishes and desires without the input from people around him. And the unnecessary need, the need of independence beyond a certain point, is a neurotic need, because that's not possible. Another need that she points out is a neurotic need, the need for perfection. इसमें भी मेरे ख्याल में आप मैं यही कहेंगे कि इसमें कौन सी ऐसी गलत बात है? Everybody wants to be better than before and wants to be perfect. So what's wrong with that? Well, if you take this need to its logical conclusion, nobody can ever be perfect, and that is why having this need is a certain recipe for unhappiness. क्योंकि कोई भी शख्स हर तरह से परफेक्ट नहीं हो सकता, इसलिए वो नाखुश और गैर मुतमइन ही रहेगा. इसलिए ये नीड न्यूरोटिक है कैरन हॉर्नी के ख्याल में, the need for perfection. She also explains another neurotic need as a need for power. I think we talked about power in negative and in positive sense. If power is to be exercised to advance oneself, then that is, of course, negative power. And that is what she is talking about. That is a neurotic need, because power is, in Horney's point of view, Karen Horney's point of view, a relative thing. A may be powerful, more powerful than B, but then A may be less powerful than C. C may be more powerful than D, but then C may be less powerful than E and F and J and K. So it is a relative thing. You would always find power to be somewhere else also, and that could be a source of dissatisfaction, and that is why she is talking about power being a need, power being a neurotic need. She also talks about the need for prestige. Again, prestige is a good idea. Everybody should be prestigious, but taking prestige beyond a certain reasonable limit is what she is talking about. And that is where prestige becomes a need, which is a neurotic need. She also talks about ambition, a reflection of approval, a reflection of power, a reflection of domination. Ambition, as Shakespeare says, usually accompanies a sickness of the mind. Ambition without boundaries, in Shakespeare's sense, is a sickness, and that is what Karen Horney is talking about. A boundless ambition is a precursor, a predeterminer of neurosis, or reflects a neurotic need. Another neurotic need that she talks about is admiration. Unnecessary admiration is a neurotic need. You have to notice, as I was describing these needs to you, that these needs may be less neurotic, if they did not go beyond the limit of rationality. But they become neurotic needs, a source of pain and dissatisfaction, because they go beyond that parameter, beyond that boundary of rationality and reasonableness. And that is what Karen Horney is talking about. Neurotic needs created as a reaction to basic anxiety, and those neurotic needs upsetting a person for the rest of his life. Neurotic needs, in Karen Horney's point of view, lead to three kinds of reactions in people, what she calls neurotic trends. Neurotic trends are a reaction to basic anxiety, leading to creation of those neurotic needs that we talked about, and those neurotic needs creating three kinds of trends. Three kinds of trends in one's social relationing, in one's social life, in one's interpersonal dealing, in one's existence in society. And what are those neurotic trends? One, what she calls movement towards people. Movement towards people is a neurotic trend in Karen Horney's point of view, because that is a trend that is prominent by a submissive, a meek posture. एक शख्स जो दूसरे लोगों पे बेजा हद तक डिपेंडेंट है, जो उनकी कंपनी का, जो उनके हालात का और जो उनके ख्यालात का एक तरह से मोहताज है, he is what she calls somebody who's meek, M-E-E-K, or overly submissive, and that is a neurotic trend, and that she identifies as movement towards people. आपने देखे होंगे कि कुछ लोग ऐसे भी हैं जो दूसरे लोगों को ज़रूरत से ज़्यादा उनको अपनी तरफ मायल करना चाहते हैं, उनको राम करना चाहते हैं, उनकी खिदमत करना चाहते हैं. This is the first neurotic trend that she talks about, as movement towards people. The second neurotic trend that she talks about that comes from her list of neurotic needs is what she calls movement away from people is characterized by a withdrawal from people, a movement towards isolation, अपने आप को दूसरे लोगों से अलहदा कर लेना, अलग थलग कर लेना. This is what she calls movement away from people, and this she considers the second neurotic trend. And the third neurotic trend that comes out of basic anxiety and those neurotic needs and expresses itself as a trend in a person is what she calls movement against people. कुछ लोग ऐसे भी हैं जो दूसरे लोगों के साथ हर वक्त मुकाबले में मसरूफ रहते हैं, नबर्द आज़मा रहते हैं. अगर किसी शख्स ने कोई गाड़ी खरीदी है, कोई किताब ली है, कोई सफ़र किया है, तो वो भी गाड़ी खरीदना चाहेंगे या किताब खरीद के पढ़ना चाहेंगे या किसी और मुल्क का सफ़र करना चाहेंगे. यानी बेजा तौर पर दूसरों से मुकाबले में मसरूफ रहना. ये तो एक एक्सप्रेशन है. मूवमेंट अगेंस्ट का और भी एक्सप्रेशन है कि एक शख्स दूसरे से किसी शख्स से भी या ग्रोह से खामखाही लड़ता रहे, खामखाही झगड़े पर आमादा रहे. बीइंग competitive is what she calls movement against people. So she talks about 3 trends which she calls neurotic trends coming out of her list of neurotic needs, which she believes those needs arise from basic anxiety, and these trends are movement towards, movement away, and movement against people. This is Karen Horney's point of view related to her analysis of neurotic trends. Keeping these in mind, she developed another concept which she called the idealized image of self. The idealized image of the self is what one would like to become, what one would prefer to be, where one would like to be. That is an idealized image. A person who is, let us say, dominated by a need for perfection, his idealized image of the self would be one of the greatest musicians or mathematician or the greatest cricket player or a great religious scholar. He sees himself as somebody who is a perfect person in the idealized image that he has of himself. So idealized image of the self is a kind of expression of one's neurotic needs and one's neurotic trends. आपको याद है, when we were talking about Jung and his concept of the collective unconscious, we also talked about archetypes, and one of the archetypes that we talked about in Jungian theory was persona. Remember, persona is the mask that we wear. When Horney is talking about an idealized image of the self, this is, you obviously can see the similarity between Jungian archetype of persona and idealized image of the self in Horney's theory. ये तकरीबन वही बात है जो युंग ने persona के reference में कही है. The idealized image of the self is what a person wants to be, to become, as an integrated personality, as a personality which has reached the peak of expression and experience. दो तरह के न्यूरोसिस का जिक्र कर रही है कैरन हॉर्नी, वो भी समझ लें. और इंटरेस्टिंग पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू है ये उसका, सिचुएशनल न्यूरोसिस एंड कैरेक्टर न्यूरोसिस. सिचुएशनल न्यूरोसिस को समझाने के लिए मैं आपको एक मिसाल दूं कि अगर एक शख्स को इम्तिहान से पहले तशवीश लाहक हो, वो 1-2 दिन पहले उसकी नींद जो है वो कम हो जाए, उड़ जाए, तो क्या हम उसको ये कहेंगे कि वो शख्स ज़हनी मरीज है? अगर एक और शख्स को अपने कारोबार में नुकसान हो जाए और वो उदास परेशान हो जाए, उसकी भूख खत्म हो जाए, उसकी नींद कम हो जाए, उसको छोटी मोटी बीमारी लाहक हो जाए, तो क्या हम उसे कहेंगे कि वो शख्स ज़हनी मरीज है? और इम्तिहान ख़त्म होने के बाद वो बच्चा या तालिब इल्म अब तशवीश महसूस ना करे और फाइनेंशियल रिकवरी के बाद वो ट्रेडर या बिजनेसमैन, he begins to sleep normally and eat normally and has gotten rid of his other physical symptoms, would we say that he had turned into a neurotic? Of course not. And that is how Karen Horney explains situational neurosis. Situational neurosis is a temporary manifestation, a temporary expression of certain mental diseases that arise as a result of some drastic change in one's situation, one's environment. And that is what she calls situational neurosis. Opposed to that is what she calls character neurosis. Character neurosis is more or less a permanent expression of the examples that I gave you. If somebody continues to feel anxiety when he or she is not faced with anxiety-producing situations, if a young man continues to be unable to sleep, has lost his sleep, even when the exams are over, even when there are no academic pressures on him, but he continues to feel sleepless at nights, that is an example of character neurosis. If a person, even when he recovers, if a businessman, even when he recovers the losses that he had suffered in his trade and in his business, even then he continues to not being able to sleep and not being able to eat properly and develop minor physical symptoms, that person has what she calls character neurosis. Karen Horney distinguishes between situational and character neurosis, and many psychologists feel that this is an important contribution of hers. Situational neurosis, a temporary manifestation of a set of symptoms that come about as a result of the influence of situational factors. And character neurosis, a more chronic, permanent expression of certain symptom syndrome that do not change as a result of, as a function of change in situational factors. This is her theory of neurosis. And what is her methodology? Remember, she trained in psychoanalysis. So, she used dream interpretation but a dialogue and a discussion in a face-to-face situation with the patient, with the client. And her attempt was to bring to the attention of the person the neurotic needs, the movements, and the kind of neurosis that he or she is suffering from, gradually making a patient realize that his problem lies in basic anxiety, giving rise to the needs, which are neurotic needs, giving rise to the trends that we talked about, resulting in the neurosis or unhappiness on the part of a person. Bringing all of these things into the consciousness of the patient was the methodology adopted by Karen Horney, a very prominent American psychologist. Let us go forward. Erich Fromm, another prominent American psychologist, psychoanalyst, trained in classical Freudian system, born 1900, died 1980, most of the time worked in Chicago and New York. As you have been informed, he was impressed with Freud's work, but in 1941, in one of the most famous books that he wrote, Escape from Freedom, he proclaimed his break from classical psychoanalysis. And what was his point of view? Again, what Horney had said, what Adler had said, and what Jung had said, that Freud had put too much emphasis on sex as a drive in human behavior. Fromm's point of view was, opposed to Freudian, that man has become free. He is no longer a slave of hunger, thirst. He is no longer a slave of fear. He is free, but at the same time, he longs to belong. इंसान आज़ाद तो है फ्रोम के ख्याल में, लेकिन उसके साथ साथ वो ये भी चाहता है कि अपनी आज़ादी में वो बिलोंग भी करे. And what is belongingness? Belonging to a family, an ideology, an idea, a country, a political philosophy, whatever shape that belongingness may take, from beliefs that man wants to belong also. And that, in Erich Fromm's point of view, is man's dilemma. He wants freedom and he wants belongingness. He wants to be free and he wants to belong also. आप अपनी ज़िंदगी में अगर नज़र दौड़ाएं तो आप देखेंगे कि फ्रोम को इतनी गैर अहम बात भी नहीं कह रहा. आपने महसूस किया होगा कि आप खुद भी यही चाहते हैं. कुछ वक्त आप चाहते हैं कि आप अपने घर से, अपने दोस्तों से, अपने मिलने जुलने वालों से आज़ाद रहें, जो आपका दिल आए वो आप करें. लेकिन उसके साथ साथ आप ये भी चाहते हैं कि आप अपने घर से, महल्ले से, दोस्त यारों से मुतल्लिक भी रहें. एंड दैट इज़ व्हाट एरिक फ्रोम इज सेइंग. A man is free, at the same time he wants to belong, and that is his dilemma. And he says that as a result of this, there take place certain orientations, certain ways of life, the way to be. What are those orientations? Expressions of life, the way to be. And what are those in Fromm's point of view? He talks about the first orientation as the receptive orientation. आप अपनी स्क्रीन पे देख रहे होंगे receptive orientation is somewhat submissive, a meek, M-E-E-K, meek stance to life. You must have come across people who have this orientation, who are meek, who are submissive, who are non-dominating, who are non-competitive, non-aggressive. निमाने जिन्हें हम कहते हैं लोकल जुबान में. And that is one orientation. And that is how Fromm says the freedom and the need for belonging can be satisfied, can be merged. That's one orientation. Another orientation is what Fromm calls the exploitative orientation. आप स्क्रीन पे भी देख रहे होंगे. Exploitative orientation is when the person is overtly aggressive, combative, when he wants that other people should give into what he wants or she wants. There are no half midways for a person who has exploitative orientation. There is an all or none attitude in exploitative orientation. And the third orientation in his view, in Fromm's view, is what he calls the hoarding orientation. आप अपनी स्क्रीन पे देख रहे होंगे. Hoarding orientation means the distrust of other people. The person hoards himself. I'm not talking about holding, I'm talking about hoarding, H-O-A-R-D-I-N-G. आप स्क्रीन पे देख लिया होगा. Hoarding person or hoarding personality is someone who distrusts others and therefore hoards affection, bank accounts, properties, possessions. He hoards them, he collects them, he hangs on to them. And thereby he feels that he is free and at the same time belongs. The other orientation that Fromm talks about is what Fromm calls the market orientation or marketing orientation. Market orientation is when a person adopts, gives into, becomes somebody who is an agent of socially accepted ways and means of being, ways and means of life. Market orientation or marketing orientation can be understood if you compare the life to a market and the person adopts himself to that market. मार्केट की अपनी डिमांड्स हैं, लाइफ सिचुएशन अपनी जगह मौजूद है, उसकी अपनी कंपल्शंस हैं. When the person accepts and becomes a part of that, then what Fromm says, he has adopted the marketing orientation. And then all of these four mentioned orientations Fromm describes as unhealthy, neurotic orientations. They are not healthy क्योंकि इनमें कोई भी ऐसी चीज नहीं है जिसकी बिना पे इंसान इंटेग्रेट हो सके, इंसान अपनी बेहतरीन सलाहियतों का इजहार कर सके. इसलिए फ्रोम के ख्याल में ये चारों ओरिएंटेशंस जो हैं ये न्यूरोटिक ओरिएंटेशंस हैं. They are unhealthy orientation. And the fifth or the last one, which is a healthy orientation, is what Fromm calls productive orientation. Productive orientation is when individual lives to realizing a full potential of who he is and where he wants to be, where his best expressions of personality can find their ways. This is what he calls productive orientation. अभी जब हम इससे आगे भी कुछ जिक्र करेंगे, खास तौर पर ह्यूमनिस्टिक साइकोलॉजिस्ट्स का, अगली दफ़े हम उन्हीं का जिक्र शुरू करेंगे, तो फिर ये प्रोडक्टिव ओरिएंटेशन का जो कॉन्सेप्ट है ये अच्छी तरह से एक्सप्लेन होगा. फॉर द टाइम बीइंग, प्रोडक्टिव ओरिएंटेशन इज द हेल्दी वे of expressing one's freedom and one's desire to belong at the same time, giving vent to or expressing a full potential of one's personality. Fromm, in his later life, became more of a social philosopher and less of a psychoanalyst. He wrote extensively, he lectured extensively, and he withdrew from one-to-one psychotherapy because he thought that lecturing and writing made him address society at large, a large number of people. He was on the way to becoming a social philosopher rather than a psychotherapist or a psychoanalyst. But he is an important and a prominent contributor in the development of psychological thought, particularly in the North American continent. Before we end today's lecture, let us review what we had talked about. We talked about two prominent North American psychologists, psychoanalysts today. One of them we had touched in the previous lecture also, but we rounded up her theory today, and that was Karen Horney. We talked about Karen Horney's list of neurotic needs. You can read them on your screen. Those needs are there. Number 1, need for approval, need for domination, need to confine life, need for perfection, need for power, another need, exploiting others, a need for prestige, a need for ambition, and a need for admiration. ये तमाम की तमाम 10 नीड्स का जिक्र जो कैरन हॉर्नी ने किया है, ये न्यूरोटिक हैं. हम एक माहिर नफ्सियात की हैसियत से या नफ्सियात के तालिब इल्म की हैसियत से इनको न्यूरोटिक इसलिए कहते हैं क्योंकि अगर ये ज़रूरियात या ख्वाहिशात, जिनका 10 ज़रूरियात और ख्वाहिशात का जिक्र जो कैरन हॉर्नी कर रही है, अगर ये एक ख़ास हद से तजावुज़ कर जाएं तो उस सूरत में they are unhealthy or neurotic. So, neurotic needs have to be curtailed. If they are not curtailed, in Karen Horney's point of view, then neurotic needs give rise to 3 kinds of movements. Remember what were those 3 kinds of movements? In dealing with people around us in groups such as colleges, schools, place of work, home, peer group, friends, clubs, in tamam social situations mein, if the needs express themselves, then they may end up in 3 movements. And what are those 3 movements? Number 1, movement towards people. A person may become overly submissive, meek, weak. In order for him to socialize, in order for him to fulfill those needs, he adopts this submissive or meek posture. That's one trend that she talks about. The other trend, the second trend that she talks about is movement away from people. a person isolating himself or herself from people around him, from social interactions. And that is the second neurotic trend emanating, resulting from those neurotic needs. And the third is what she calls movement against, when a person, as a result of his neurotic needs, becomes competitive, takes other people as adversaries and is ready to fight them, finds himself in competition with them all the time. So he is aggressively involved in combating them. And that is what she calls the third neurotic trend. Karen Horney also distinguishes between situational neurosis and character neurosis. You remember, I gave you the examples of situational neurosis, when a person is near an exam and he or she feels anxiety. The situational factors are creating this little bit of upsetting mental attitude in her. So that's an example of situational neurosis. And then she talks about character neurosis. Even when there are no situational factors, if a person continues to feel the burden of neurosis, that is an example of character neurosis. The distinction between situational and character is another important contribution of Karen Horney's. The second person that we talked about today in the present context was Erich Fromm. Erich Fromm put forward the view that man has become free, but he longs to belong. He wants freedom and he wants belongingness. And these are two conflicting demands. These give rise to what he calls 5 orientations. And those orientations are: the first, the receptive orientation, the meek or submissive attitude that a person may develop. Second, the exploitative orientation. You can see it on your screen also. The aggressive, the competitive orientation. And then the third, the hoarding orientation. An orientation where there is distrust of others in a person. And the fourth, the marketing orientation. When a person fits himself in the market conditions, he goes along with whatever life demands from him. A kind of a selling style he adopts. All of these 4, Erich Fromm thought, were neurotic orientations, were orientations which were not healthy orientations. So what is the healthy orientation in Fromm's point of view? What he calls productive orientation. To be able to realize one's potential and to be able to get the best of these 2 conflicting demands that one has. The desire, the need to be free, and the desire and need to belong. If and when one can mesh them together and realize one's full potential, that is what he calls productive orientation, and that is the healthy orientation. As I said, Erich Fromm in his later life had become more of a social scientist, more of a quasi-prophet than simply a psychoanalyst. He wrote and lectured extensively and created a vast impact on the contemporary psychological American scene. These are 2 very important North American psychologists. We will take a look at some other ones in the next lecture. Until that time, do look these things up, do enjoy reading, and do look after yourselves. Until next time, Khuda Hafiz, God be with you.